Hey guys, tonight we drift into one of the quieter corners of Roman history. Quieter, quite literally, because it's all about snoring. Not just any snoring, though professional snoring. Orchestrated, rhythmic, state-sanctioned snoozing. You're about to descend into the soft, strange world of an ancient guild that made its name by breathing loudly in the dark. You're probably thinking, professional snorers, that can't be real. And to be fair, you're not alone. Even modern scholars do a double take when they first see the records buried beneath layers of tax scrolls, grain inventories, and the occasional complaint about goat theft. But tucked deep in the archives of the Roman Forum, beneath layers of marble dust and long-forgotten graffiti, you find something unexpected. A slim, sleep-stained scroll stamped with the faded seal of the Somniculorum Collegium, the Guild of Sleepers. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you're listening from a cold attic in Estonia or a hammock in the Philippines, let me know where you are and what time it is. I love seeing how far this sleepy little corner of the internet reaches. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're in the Forum long after dark. Tourists are gone. Torches flicker in their sconces, and you're elbow-deep in a dusty storage chamber, following the whispers of old parchment. One scroll in particular stands out. It crackles when you touch it, like it hasn't been handled in centuries. It's labeled with a sleepy-eyed owl perched on a laurel branch. Beneath that, faded Latin in uneven hand, on the regulation and honor of the snoring classes. You laugh softly, then stop, because the next line, it's a roster. Names, dozens of them, followed by titles like Lead Bass Sleeper, Midnight Rumbler, and best of all, Honorary Bedrock. You blink. This wasn't a joke. This was a guild. Historians still argue whether it was purely ceremonial or if these sleepers served a functional role, perhaps soothing anxiety in crowded insulae, or performing a ritualistic service of comfort in public courtyards. One fringe theory even suggests they were used as living metronomes for meditation or prayer, their snoring measured and trained to specific tempos, like living wind instruments, but slightly more nasal. You trace the roster with your fingers. One name is circled in faded red, Titus Flavius Dorsarius, first of the deep breathers, and beside it a date, year 212 CE, the reign of Caracalla, the emperor who extended citizenship to all free men in the empire and, apparently, also had a fondness for scheduled naps. You look around the chamber. There are bits of wax earplugs, a carved wooden headrest, an oddly luxurious pillow that smells faintly of lavender and old sandalwood. You're starting to think they took this seriously. You rise from the scroll and glance around, half expecting someone in a linen toga to step out from behind a pillar and ask if you've been properly initiated. But the only sound is the soft hum of night wind drifting down from the Palatine. You tuck the scroll into your satchel, not to steal, just to read more carefully later. Then you step out into the Forum, which now feels quieter, as if someone is still snoring just beneath the cobblestones. You head toward a quieter wing of the city, now past shuttered market stalls and the occasional bronze statue that always seems to be judging your sandals. The air grows warmer as you cross into the residential quarters, where Roman life quiets after sunset. But tonight, you're not following the bakers or the bathers. You're looking for the original headquarters of Rome's strangest civic service. The Guild of Professional Snorers didn't just exist, they had an office. Or at least, what passed for one. Tucked between a public latrine and a cheese merchant's stall, there was once a modest domus with a painted door. Over the lintel, a carved relief of 3 sleeping men and one very unimpressed cat. This was the administrative heart of the Somniculorum Collegium. Inside, you find a layout that's oddly cozy, not grand, not imposing, more like a very serious nap parlor. Pillows line the benches. There are small clay plaques on the walls showing various sleep postures, curled, flat, half upright. One even depicts someone dangling slightly off a cot, which the accompanying inscription calls the Drunken Gladiator. In the center of the room sits a sign and tablet, wax slate, slightly cracked. The names scratched in are layered like rings on a tree. Decades of sleepers checking in for duty. Because yes, snoring in ancient Rome was a job. You learn quickly that the guild wasn't just about noise. It was about presence. In crowded urban housing blocks, the sounds of violence, argument, and late-night political gossip could keep citizens awake and anxious. But hearing someone snore, a steady, slow, deeply relaxed person, was reassuring. It meant someone nearby felt safe enough to drift off. And safety is contagious. The state caught on. Soon, Rome began placing certified snorers in public rest areas, communal housing, and temples during overnight vigils. They were the living embodiment of calm, of predictable rhythm, of normalcy. Historians still argue whether they were ever officially funded through the public treasury, or if they operated more like musicians relying on patronage and donations for their hush-based performances. You poke through a side room and find something unexpected: a payment ledger. Tiny stylus scratches detail, compensation in the form of olives, cured meats, and in one particularly odd case, half a goat, presumably the back half. Still, some entries are tagged with silver denaries, which means someone paid real money to be surrounded by snorers. You can't help but wonder how many modern cities would benefit from that kind of service. At the back of the guild house is a larger room, slightly sunken, lined with tiered platforms. At first, you think it's a lecture hall, then you notice the mats, the candle alcoves, the faint smell of laurel oil and worn sandals. It's a nap chamber, and not just for training. This was the civic snore room. You sit on one of the benches and close your eyes. You try to imagine it. A dozen men, professionally drowsy, positioned for acoustic maximum, light breathing harmonized, gentle rasping arranged by pitch and tempo. One man stationed in each corner for spatial coverage, perhaps a lead snorer placed in the center, whose deep inhalations set the pace for the rest. The room must have sounded like a forest floor on a warm summer night. Soft rustlings, warm breath, occasional gentle whistles through crooked noses. You exhale. You get it now. They weren't just snorers, they were ambassadors of rest. And as the wind sighs through the open windows of the guild house, you find yourself wondering if they still echo somewhere in the stone. You shuffle your feet across the cool stone floor, moving deeper into the building, where the lighting dims and the walls lean in with centuries of exhale. There's an alcove just off the nap chamber lined with cracked mosaics and frescoes, faintly tinged with ochre and blue. At its center, a bronze plaque, oddly well-preserved. It reads, "Here lay Dorsarius, who snored through a riot and brought peace to a city on fire." You blink, then smile. This was it, the founding myth of the Snorers. And like all good Roman guilds, it starts not with bureaucracy but with chaos. Picture this. It's a hot summer afternoon in 2nd century CE Rome. The forum is crowded, tensions are high, and someone's angry about grain shortages. Someone else is angry about that someone's sandals. Fists fly, pots are broken. A mule cart overturns. Voices rise like steam from a bathhouse, and suddenly, you've got a riot. Guards are overwhelmed. Senators hide behind statues. A particularly unlucky merchant is trying to protect his grape display with a ladle, and in the middle of it all, one man, lying flat on a bench, snoring. Not mildly, not embarrassedly, but with full, glorious nasal authority. His name, Titus Flavius Dorsarius, a marble worker by trade, a napper by vocation. And on that day, he did not stir, not for shouting, not for smoke, not even when someone threw a half-roasted turnip near his head. His breathing stayed steady, deep, measured. The story goes that by the 3rd hour of chaos, people began to pause. The snoring was so loud, so defiantly unbothered. It created a surreal stillness around him. People stared. Some even sat down. A street performer gave up and napped next to him. Slowly, the riot fizzled. Not from force, but from a kind of contagious apathy. Why fight when this man is clearly winning? Historians still argue whether this account was exaggerated by the guild in later years. Some suspect Dorsarius was drunk. Others think he may have passed out from heat stroke. and was mistaken for enlightened. One very bold theory suggests the riot never even happened, that it was a metaphor for resisting overreaction in turbulent times. But the guild believed, and that's what mattered. They adopted Dorsarius as their patron sleeper. A statue of him once stood in the atrium of the guild house, a reclining figure with one hand under his cheek and a faint smile carved into his jowls. Local children would rub his nose for luck before exams. Newly recruited Snorers were expected to recite his story before their first public nap. You find the base of that statue now, only the toes remain. Still, you can feel the presence. It's oddly inspiring, really. In a city obsessed with rhetoric, conquest, and shouting from balconies, he slept, and that became the ideal, not fight, not flight, but full exhale. You notice a final line on the plaque. Let the world do what it will. I'll be here. Breathing. You trace the letters slowly, and as your fingers pass over the final word, a breeze drifts through the broken ceiling, lifting dust in lazy spirals. You breathe with it, just like he did. You wander into a side room dimly lit by a narrow shaft of moonlight, filtering through a slatted ceiling like the hush of a whispered lullaby. It smells of wool and cedar soft, earthy, forgettable in the way ancient comfort always is. Along the wall are clay tablets, stacked loosely, each etched with rows of tallies and numbers. You've stumbled into the payroll room, because yes, snoring in ancient Rome wasn't just art, it was labor. And labor, as any Roman would agree, deserved compensation. You settle onto a stone bench, tracing the pay records. Each name is followed by an amount, and then a symbol, a barley sprig, a folded blanket, a goat's ear. Payment wasn't always coin. Sometimes it was produce, sometimes livestock. Once, a snorer was paid with 2 baskets of figs and a kiss on the cheek from a very confused senator's wife. Historians still argue whether these odd payments were symbolic, part of a ritual, or simply the result of Rome's creative bartering system. But one thing is clear, professional snorers didn't just exist, they were valued. You flip over a slate and find a crude pie chart drawn in wax, probably by a board administrator. It breaks down compensation by role. The lead bass snorer receives the most, followed by the harmonizers, and lastly, the trainee huffers. You smile. It's a hierarchy built on nasal resonance. But what's even more fascinating is the benefits section. Members of the Somniculorum Collegium were granted access to public bathhouses during quiet hours, monthly refills of eucalyptus balm for airway clarity, 1 ceremonial feather pillow per Saturnalia size, negotiable, exemption from public shouting during civic unrest. That last one, surprisingly helpful in Rome. You spot a wall carving 3 men reclining on cushioned couches, one with cheeks puffed, another mid-snore, and a third holding up a bronze goblet marked Best Breath Control. The caption underneath reads, "To labor is noble, to snore is divine." Of course, not all compensation was material. Social prestige mattered. There were annual competitions. The Somnus Maximus, where Rome's elite sleepers competed in categories such as longest continuous exhale, least disturbed by noise, and most soothing cadence. The winner received a laurel wreath, a golden sleep mask, and their name carved into the guild's wall of honor. You run your fingers over that wall now, hundreds of names, fading into one another. Some are followed by tiny symbols, a shell, a drooping eyelid, even a carved sheep. Apparently, that one belonged to a snorer who could lull livestock into unconsciousness. You lean back on the bench and exhale. It's not just a joke. It's a whole system. A society that recognized the quiet, the uncelebrated, the absurd dignity of breathing in public and doing it well. And in a world that screamed, these people slept. You close your eyes for a moment and listen. The sound of distant traffic fades from your mind. You can almost hear it low, deep, steady, a rhythmic hum in the back of ancient Rome. Someone was snoring with purpose. You leave the payroll room with a gentle creak of the door, stepping back into the heart of the guild house. And there it is, just as the scroll hinted, Rome's original sleep amphitheater. It's smaller than a coliseum, but still grand in its own quiet way. Semicircular stone seating, smooth from centuries of use. curves around a recessed stage, but there's no podium, no instruments, just cushions, layers and layers of woven mats and pillows in a wide arc, arranged like the petals of a very sleepy flower. You sit on one of the upper tiers, barely daring to shift your weight for fear of squeaking. The air is thick with a sense of ceremony, of rehearsed hush. This, you learn, is where the public sleep performances took place. Picture it. You arrive just after dusk. The audience is invited to recline. Warm wine is served not too strong, just enough to nudge the mind into fog. Lamps glow dimly behind soft cloth panels, casting gentle shadows on the mosaic floor. And then, the snorers begin. Not all at once. That would be barbaric. First, a solo, one deep inhalation, a slow exhale through the nose, a rumble like distant thunder over hills. Then a second joins in higher-pitched, fluttery, with just a hint of congestion. By the third, you realize this is orchestration, a deliberate layering of tones. Like monks chanting but horizontal, the crowd doesn't applaud. That would defeat the point. They breathe along. Inhale, hold, release. Historians still argue whether these performances had therapeutic intent or were simply meant to demonstrate the skill and discipline required for professional-grade snoring. Some sources suggest they were used to ease tension during times of political unrest, calming citizens without a single speech. One senator, in a rare surviving diary entry, described the effect as being sung to sleep by ghosts wrapped in blankets. There were even themes. Autumn concerts included snorers trained in a whisper breath technique called leaf fall. Winter sessions featured what they called bear nap bass, where a trio of larger men attempted to recreate hibernation rhythms using nothing but breath, body weight, and pure willpower. You stare at the worn stone stage. It was never about volume. It was about trust. To sleep in front of strangers, to lower your guard, your jaw, and your dignity without shame, that's a public act. Few modern performances dare to demand. And when the concert ended, there were no bows, just a slow, synchronized rising, a stretch, a satisfied yawn, and then the shuffling of sandals on stone as the audience wandered off, just a little lighter than before. You lean forward and whisper into the amphitheater. Bravo! Somewhere, a pigeon coos in approval. You rise from the stone seat and stretch, your spine echoing the same quiet cracks that surely resonated here 2,000 years ago. It's late now. Moonlight casting long silver bars across the floor, and it feels right to continue down the narrow passage beside the amphitheater. You shuffle carefully, guided by the faint scent of lavender and beeswax. At the end of the corridor, you discover a curious chamber. This isn't for sleeping, it's for training. Welcome to the Snorers Academy. Every respectable guild in Rome had an apprentice system, and the Somnicularum were no exception. You step inside a room that feels like a cross between a school and a spa. Along the walls, you find wooden mannequins rudimentary, padded posed in different sleeping postures. Some are flat, some curled, one suspended by rope in what looks like the ancient prototype for a hammock. Each model is labeled Lunar Cuddle, Citizen's Curl, Minerva's Elbow Slide. Beside them, instructions, not on fighting, not on rhetoric, but on breathing. You learn that the most elite snorers were trained in a technique called the echo loop, a rhythmic breath pattern designed to lull listeners into a state of deep trance. Achieving this loop required weeks of nasal conditioning, vocal humming, and chest resonance exercises performed with warm stones balanced on the belly. There's a practice cot in the center. Overhead, a pulley holds a hollow ceramic funnel, a sort of ancient sound amplifier. Trainees would lie beneath it, projecting their snores into the funnel, where a sleepy mentor would judge them from behind a tapestry with a scoring slate. Too shrill, you got the mosquito of the forum rating. Too weak, distant goat, perfect resonance. Echo of Diana. Historians still argue whether these classifications were serious rankings or just hazing rituals. One theory suggests the best students were sent to perform in temples as part of sacred rites, particularly during fertility festivals and harvest vigils. You find a student journal tucked behind a wall niche. The parchment is covered in doodles, mostly sleepy faces and exaggerated noses. But amid the nonsense are notations of surprising discipline. Day 9. Still can't hold the bass hum longer than 8 seconds. Must stop laughing when instructed to snore like a foghorn on a date. You grin. Even in ancient times, students were students. Further along the wall, painted in mineral-rich reds and purples, is a motto. To breathe deeply is to believe deeply. And then something stranger, a carved bust wearing a stylized sleep mask. Beneath it, Per effectus somni, chief of sleep. You found the statue of a man named Aurelius Umbra, the guild's most legendary instructor. He was rumored to have trained over 300 apprentices, known for his unique blend of gentle encouragement and aggressive napping demonstrations. Umbra was said to be able to fall asleep in any position, including during rainfall, mid-sentence, and once, famously, while riding a mule. One fringe tale claims he once stopped a gladiator match by reclining dramatically in the sand and snoring so magnificently that the entire audience joined in, resulting in the first and only nap riot in Colosseum history. You can't help but admire him, not for his noise, but for his quiet authority. You trace the lines of the bust, lean against the cot, and for just a moment, let your eyes close. You're not asleep. You're training. When your eyes flutter open, there's a subtle shift in the atmosphere, like the walls themselves are exhaling. You rise slowly from the training cot, step quietly across the floor, and push open a creaky door at the far end of the academy. You expect another chamber. Instead, you step into a courtyard drenched in soft moonlight. It's silent. And then, not silence, snoring. Dozens of soft, layered snores drifting through the air like a lullaby carried by olive-scented breeze. You found it, the dormitorium communis, or as one wax tablet called it, the snoozery. The courtyard is enclosed by ivy-covered colonnades and stone archways. At its center lies a circular sleep platform, covered in layered woolen mats and feather-stuffed bolsters, arranged neatly like slices of a pie. This is where the guild came together not to train or perform, but to rest. Together, the act of collective sleeping in Rome wasn't new bathhouses, military barracks, and insulae courtyards all saw some form of group slumber. But here, the somnicularum elevated it to ritual. You read a plaque nailed to a weathered wooden post. Communal rest deepens trust. Trust deepens sleep. And it makes sense. For a city that pulsed with ambition, ego, and the ever-looming threat of tax collectors, finding a place to let go was revolutionary. You step lightly between sleeping mats, careful not to disturb the air. At one end, you notice a raised dais, a sort of ancient sound booth. A clay bell sits on the edge, etched with the words, "When silence grows uneven, ring once." This was the role of the somnus curator, the night warden of rest. If someone's snoring fell off rhythm, or a night breeze made the blankets flutter, the curator rang the bell softly, prompting a collective breath reset. Historians still argue whether this was a serious position or a tongue-in-cheek way to keep trainees in line. A recent fringe theory even suggests it functioned as a proto-therapy group for stress relief. One letter from a retired soldier claims, "I hadn't slept peacefully since Gaul. Then I joined the Snorers. They didn't speak, just breathed. And somehow, it worked." You crouch beside one of the mats. A nameplate reads, "Gaius Plinius, Senior Hum Specialist." You pause. Because yes, this was more than breath. This was acoustic chemistry. Each member had a role. Some specialized in high-frequency hums, others in deep-chested rumbles. One guild member was known for the rare skill of intermittent puffing, described as like a hedgehog exhaling into a seashell. And when they slept together, they didn't just drift off. They harmonized. Like an ancient respiratory choir, you recline on a vacant mat and stare at the stars above. Somewhere near your elbow, someone lets out a perfect three-part nasal sonata. You try to match your breathing to the rhythm, not because you have to, but because it feels good. The courtyard seems to swell with calm, not empty silence, intentional quiet. There's a difference. And in that difference, you begin to understand why this guild endured. Because snoring, when done right, wasn't a flaw. It was faith in the present moment. You close your eyes again, just for a bit. A gentle rustle stirs you like a blanket being pulled across stone. You sit up slowly, blinking into the muted gray of early dawn. The snores around you are still deep in their chorale, but the tone has shifted lower now, more bass-heavy. as if the dreams themselves are growing denser. You stretch, then notice a small door tucked behind a flowering fig tree in the courtyard wall. Naturally, you open it. Inside is a narrow staircase, winding downward. The air grows cooler with each step, and the walls grow rougher, less polished marble, more raw limestone. The steps finally deliver you to a low, vaulted chamber. You found the Snorers archive. It smells like damp wool and beeswax, and it is perfectly quiet. Not the deliberate silence of a hush, but the kind that's simply accepted, like a cat that's been asleep on your lap for the last hour and you didn't even notice. You light a small oil lamp and begin scanning the shelves. They are packed with scrolls, not military records, not political decrees, but things like humidity versus nose whistle, a 5-year study, dream patterns in men named Titus, seasonal drift of mid-nap groans, and one bound volume marked in gold leaf, the Codex of Forgotten Sleep. You open it carefully. The pages are uneven, the ink faded to a reddish brown, but the content is surprisingly detailed. You learn that the guild had a robust system for cataloging dream reports, especially those deemed sound-influenced. One report describes a member dreaming of sheep every night the Huffers train nearby. Another mentions recurring dreams of waterfalls later traced to a leaky amphora 2 rooms over. Historians still argue whether these connections were legitimate early observations of environmental influence on sleep, or just post-nap gossip written in elaborate prose. But what's undeniable is their dedication. These were people who measured rest, who archived dreams, who took notes on which humidity levels led to the most satisfying sighs. You spot a shelf labeled Contraband Techniques. Curious. You reach for a rolled scroll tucked in a leather tube. It details a banned method known as the reverse sigh, practiced only by advanced members. It involved inhaling through the nose with such delicacy that it mimicked a satisfied exhale, supposedly confusing nearby listeners into feeling at peace. One practitioner, it's said, could calm livestock this way. Another claimed a passing magistrate proposed to him mid-snore, mistaking serenity for charisma. The guild eventually banned it. Too powerful, too seductive. You chuckle, then carefully reshelve the scroll. There's a final corner in the chamber marked with painted stars. On a raised pedestal rests a stone bowl filled with fragments of broken wax tablets. You pick one up and see a single word: gratitude. This was the ritual of endnotes. At the end of every lunar cycle, each member would write a single word onto a tablet to describe the best part of their rest: warmth, quiet, my toes, not hearing, my cousin. The tablets were then broken and placed here, like votive offerings to the goddess Somnia. You sit down on a low stool and exhale, and in that stillness, surrounded by dust and soft echoes of ancient sighs, you realize something. The Romans understood noise. They understood politics, war, spectacle. But the Snorers, they understood absence, the value of a breath in, a pause, and a breath out. You lean back and let the archives keep you company. As you ease back up the staircase, leaving the archives behind, there's a slight warmth returning to the air. The sun must be creeping its way into the upper courtyards. You find yourself stepping into a corridor you hadn't noticed before, lined with painted panels and soft drapes fluttering in the breeze. The floor is cushioned with worn rugs stitched together from old cloaks. This is the ceremonial wing, a space reserved not for training or sleeping, but celebrating the act of sleep. You wouldn't expect Roman rituals to center around something so passive. But here, the Somnicularum had their own calendar of observances, at least 5 major festivals a year, each one dedicated to a different sleep archetype. You walk past hand-painted banners, each featuring a character. The Snore Oracle, eyes closed, one finger raised as if mid-dream prophecy. The Yawning Muse, with lips parted and a daisy crown. The Blanket Prophet, who wore 7 cloaks in summer and claimed to feel future tremors through his knees. You stop at an altar dedicated to Somnia Calma, patroness of untroubled minds. Her shrine is simple, a low stone platform covered in wild thyme and rose petals, and beside it, a carved bowl filled with pebbles. The guild believed in a form of psychological shedding before sleep. You whispered your worries into a pebble and placed it into the bowl. Every week, the pebbles were ceremoniously scattered into the Tiber, so the river could carry the burden of dreams. Historians still argue whether this practice originated with the somniculorum or was adapted from rural traditions, possibly Etruscan in origin. But what matters more is how deeply the practice was revered. You find a wax tablet near the altar with dozens of pebbles labeled in charcoal ink. Taxes, the Senate, unsaid things, my neighbor's flute. You add your own, too many tabs open, and drop it in. The rituals weren't limited to calming ceremonies. On the spring equinox, the guild held the Festival of the Fold, a grand communal blanket folding event in which teams competed to create the most elegant, symmetrical bed setup. Winners received a ceremonial sleep robe dyed with imported woad, and the honor of leading that night's communal nap. Yes, leading. The guild believed that the first sleeper in a group set the tone for all others. A poor lead might bring uneven breath, disruptive jerks, or an unfortunate whimper. But a graceful sleeper, silent, confident, committed could lead a room to slumber like a lullaby cast across bricks. You approach a shallow basin containing traces of lavender oil and crushed chamomile. This is where participants anointed their temples before sacred sleep. A nearby scroll explains the proper ritual motion. 3 clockwise circles, 1 nose tap, and a long breath while reciting. Let heaviness bring healing. You follow the motion. It's silly, it's beautiful, and it's working. You turn a corner and come across something that stops you cold. A fresco of Aurelius Umbra. Yes, that Umbra sleeping atop a lion, or at least attempting to. The lion looks unimpressed. Below it, the phrase, "He dreamed for all of Rome." You laugh quietly, then bow your head in reverence. Not because he snored best, but because he made others feel safe enough to follow him into sleep. You linger in the ceremonial wing a while longer, tracing the mural borders, touching the folded robes, inhaling the air laced with herbs and history. There is a silence here that is neither sad nor sacred. It's inviting. And before you know it, you're breathing slower again. This time, on purpose. You drift out of the ceremonial wing, feeling both lighter and somehow fuller, as if sleep, that most invisible of rituals, now has weight in your hands. The corridor curves and narrows, and soon you find yourself walking through a part of the complex where the marble gives way to painted plaster and creaking wood. Fewer murals here, fewer scrolls, but the scent of warm barley bread drifts through the air. You're in Tranquillitas, the nap district. Not a metaphor, an actual residential quarter of Rome, built specifically for scheduled community napping. You step into a narrow street lined with one-story dwellings. The windows are covered with reed blinds, and the rooftops sport thick layers of olive leaves and sheep's wool for insulation. One door stands slightly ajar, revealing a cozy interior, soft floor mats, woven ceiling tapestries, and a low table with a ceramic bowl labeled for sleep grapes only. Because yes, apparently there were snacking rules here too. You peek into several other homes. Each one feels like it's been gently dipped in serenity. No bright mosaics, no oil lamp glare, just cool, pale hues and soft textile drapes swaying in slow rhythm. The people of Tranquillitas, you realize, weren't necessarily part of the guild. They were its audience. They lived here for the ambiance. They believed in the power of ambient sleep. Public schedules were posted daily at the plaza's central board. First nap, 3rd hour after dawn. Midday slumber, sun at midpoint. Twilight drift, after communal cybele, festival nap, coordinated with moonrise. Each session was accompanied by a designated snoring guide, a guild member stationed at the fountain to begin the rhythmic hum that would signal everyone to recline. Historians still argue whether these guides were truly necessary or just ceremonial mascots. Some fringe scholars believe they had a form of proto-civic power, noting that no crimes were ever recorded during scheduled nap hours, not because of fear, but because, well, everyone was asleep. You settle onto a cushioned bench in the plaza. A faint breeze picks up, carrying the delicate shushing of leaves overhead. And then you hear it. a low, dependable snore from an open window nearby. It's not loud, it's not theatrical, but it's timed. Every 6 seconds, in and out, just enough to pull your thoughts into rhythm with it. You glance around. A baker pauses mid-need. A child curls into her mother's lap. Even a street dog lays its head down, tail twitching once before it sighs into the stone. It's not hypnosis, it's permission, in tranquilitas. The world pauses not to sleep forever but to reset, to nap on purpose. You rise and wander deeper into the district, eventually finding a courtyard framed by ancient fig trees and grapevine trellises. A stone plaque reads, "The heaviest sleep wins," a quote attributed to Marcus Tullius Naptimus, allegedly the district's founding elder, though many believe he was invented as a running joke. You like him anyway. The story goes, he once slept through the entire great census of 28 BCE, only to awaken and declare, "If you need my number that badly, dream it." You could stay here all day. In fact, you might, but there are still a few corridors left to explore. So, with a reluctant exhale, you rise from the bench and step away slowly, like someone easing out of a warm bath, unwilling to break the spell too suddenly, because the magic of tranquilitas doesn't shout, it breathes. You tiptoe out of tranquilitas, careful not to disturb anyone or anything that might still be mid-dream. The street curls sharply, leading to a darker, cooler passage. You duck beneath a crumbling lintel stone and find yourself entering a space lit only by pale shafts of filtered daylight. The scent changes here. Less herbs and wool, more beeswax, figwood, and something faintly smoky. Welcome to the Hall of Dream Oracles. It takes a moment for your eyes to adjust. When they do, you see rows of stone benches fanning out around a raised platform. This isn't a theater, it's a listening chamber. The acoustics are uncanny. Even your breath sounds like it traveled across a cave. At the center stands a circular depression, filled with woven mats and soft pillows, their edges inked with abstract spiral designs. This is where the Somnicularum oracles would sleep. Yes, sleep, not speak. Because here, they believe dreams spoke through breath. Not quite prophecy. Not exactly mysticism, just extremely attentive. Snore analysis. The guild would gather silently, often before dawn, and listen as their designated oracle entered a deep, guided sleep. Every twitch, hiccup, or nasal flutter was interpreted like a riddle. You walk around the edge of the platform. Carved into the wall are fragments of past interpretations. A soft exhale after 3 sharp snorts. A flood delayed by kindness. 1 whistle followed by 2 hums exos a child is born with teeth. Flat snore. Mid-sigh. Leg twitch equals olive harvest to be cursed. You blink. Okay, that last one feels a little personal. Historians still argue whether these interpretations were ever taken seriously by Rome's upper classes, or whether they were more of a community ritual, like reading tea leaves at brunch, but with more wool and fewer complaints. But one record notes that a general postponed a campaign after an oracle snored in the pattern of a thunderstorm. And sure enough, rain drowned the supply roads 2 days later. Coincidence? The dreamers would say no. You spot a pedestal covered in polished stones. Each one bears a faint symbol, an eye, a moon, a stylized yawn. These were interpretive tokens, handed out after ceremonies, so attendees could carry the dream home. It wasn't about believing in fortune-telling. It was about connecting with something quiet, something shared, something strange enough to feel sacred. There's a whisper behind you, but when you turn, it's only a draft moving the tapestries. Still, you sense something else in the air here. A reverence you haven't felt since visiting that temple in Cyprus, where even the goats walk sideways out of respect. You settle onto one of the benches and close your eyes. Just for a minute, you breathe in, then out, and begin to imagine what your snores might say. Maybe they'd hint at too many open browser tabs. Maybe they'd murmur about a dream you left unfinished 5 years ago. Or maybe they'd say nothing at all. Because sometimes the silence between breaths carries all the truth you'll ever need. The silence of the dream hall follows you like a sleepy cat as you leave, patting at your heels but never quite meowing. You turn a corner and step into a narrow tunnel carved into the bedrock itself. The air is cooler here, more intentional, like someone designed this passage for secret comings and goings. It opens into a dimly lit chamber. At first glance, you think you've stumbled into a bathhouse. Steam curls along the ceiling. There are benches, oils, piles of towels. But then you notice the faint sound of a whistle, not the sharp kind used for gladiator cues, but soft, deliberate, slightly nasal. You're in the guild conflict room. Yes, conflict. Not all snoozing was serene. It turns out the Somniculorum were not the only acoustically inclined organization in ancient Rome. There was another, the Whisper Poets of Aventine, a rival guild who believed sleep was best achieved through barely audible recitations of odes, riddles, and what one scribe described as passive-aggressive lullabies. The rivalry was long-standing and petty. You find a wall-length fresco depicting one infamous clash, the Sai Siege of 22 BCE. The Snorers had set up a rhythmic nap demonstration in the city square, only for the Whisper Poets to stage a counter-performance across the plaza. The resulting sonic interference created what was later called the droning spiral, where passers-by were neither fully soothed nor fully awake, just caught in a loop of confused blinking. That night, several bakers miscounted loaves. One senator claimed his toga folded itself. A goat walked backward into a temple and wouldn't leave until someone read it poetry. Historians still argue whether this rivalry was symbolic to philosophies of rest, or whether it was simply a turf war between performers with very different microphones. You peek behind a curtain and find several confiscated scrolls. One is titled, A Quiet War: Tactics for Desynchronizing Breath. It details techniques like intermittent sigh insertion, nasal, heme redirection, and the incredibly controversial throat clarity fake-out, where a snorer would pretend to cough just enough to disrupt a whisper poet's pacing. It was messy and hilarious. There's even a wax tablet on display with the scribbled complaint. He snored an iambic hexameter. Utterly disrespectful. The guild eventually created peace treaties called sleep compromises, which involved alternating performances, shared amphorae of chamomile wine, and one infamous duel where two representatives tried to outsleep each other on opposite ends of a wool pile. The winner, no one knows, because everyone in attendance fell asleep before the final snore. You smile at the thought. Even the most somnolent societies had drama. Passive-aggressive sleep rituals, performance envy, competitive comfort. And honestly, it's kind of comforting, because if even the ancient world's most peaceful citizens had to schedule true snaps, maybe it's okay when your group chat spirals because someone used the emoji out of context. You linger a little longer, listening to a faint residual hum likely from some echo built into the chamber centuries ago. Or maybe, just maybe, the Whisper Poets are still here, saying nothing at all, but meaning everything. You ease out of the conflict room with the same reverence one might leave a library of old jokes, grateful, amused, and slightly uncertain if someone's still snoring behind you. The corridor curves upward now, gently climbing back toward the sunlight. Along the walls, small alcoves appear, each housing an odd little object resting on velvet cloth. You've arrived at the Somniculorum Archives of Sleep Tools. Yes, tools. Because contrary to modern assumptions, ancient Rome didn't just lie down and wait for sleep. They engineered it. You move slowly past displays that wouldn't look out of place in a steampunk nap boutique. First up, the vibrissa, a soft bronze comb used not for hair, but for rhythmic cheek brushing. Guild members swore it simulated the sensation of gentle wind, and could lull even the most jittery merchant into slumber. The instructions recommend 300 strokes per cheek. You imagine trying it. You'd be asleep or bored by stroke 40. Next, The echo pillow, essentially a hollow terracotta headrest with narrow tubes inside. When used properly, your own exhale would travel through the tubes and return a whisper of yourself back to your ears. Not quite words, just breath ghost. Some believed it made them feel less alone during sleep. Others claimed it sounded like arguing with your past self underwater. Historians still argue whether these tools had any measurable effect or if their power lay in ritual. The idea that rest required effort, not just accident. Further down, you see the insomnialis rod, a short stick wrapped in layered linen, placed between the knees to correct posture during sleep. Think of it like a polite, ancient body pillow with delusions of medical grandeur. Records say one guild member became famous for sculpting his rods into small animals, cats, turtles, and once, a nearly lifelike hedgehog. You turn a corner and spot something truly peculiar, a box labeled Snore Prism. It's unclear what it does. Some scrolls suggest it redirected nasal turbulence into aesthetic consonants. Others say it was a prank, used to make a sleeper's breath sound like distant flutes. One theory claims it worked too well. Snorers who used it never woke up because they simply enjoyed their own soundtrack too much. You nod slowly. Respect. The final display isn't an object but a quilt, stretched along the far wall. Each patch contains a symbol, a yawn, a moon, a pillow with wings. Every time a guild member reached 50 consecutive nights of dreamless, uninterrupted sleep, they were allowed to stitch a patch. The quilt faded, fraying. But still here is enormous, larger than a Senate bench. You touch it gently, and it feels warm. Maybe from the sun filtering through the clerestory windows, or maybe from the decades of shared softness woven into every thread. You exhale, let your shoulders drop, and whisper. Sleep was serious work. You continue forward, trailing your fingers along the stone wall, wondering what ancient dreamers would make of your glowing rectangles, your 5-minute meditations, your late-night doom scrolling under LED stars. Maybe they'd scoff, or maybe they'd hand you a Vibrisa comb and tell you to start at the cheeks, because rest, as it turns out, is a team sport, and sometimes a very, very weird one. You exit the archive chamber with the distinct feeling that sleep should be classified as both a science and an art, equal parts pillow and poetry. The next corridor leads downward once more, this time through a series of carved archways that grow progressively smaller. Like yawns in reverse, you duck under the final arch and emerge into a long, low-ceilinged room bathed in a honey-colored glow. This is the Snorers' Hall of Records, a room dedicated not to tools or rivalries, but to the people themselves. Every inch of wall is covered with smooth clay plaques, each etched with a name, a breath pattern, and of course the signature snore tone. There's Gaius Flavius, whose exhale resembled a falling lyre string. There's Junia Sabella, famous for the rare triple snort rumble combo. One entry claims a man named Nestor Rufus could produce a harmonic resonance that lulled birds into synchronized wing naps. The snorers were not anonymous. They were documented. This wasn't vanity. It was calibration. Each guild member underwent regular tonal assessments. Their pitch, rhythm, and decibel level were recorded by scribes using a scroll system loosely inspired by musical notation. One particularly obsessive scroll from 17 CE reads, "Subject's third stage snore now vibrates floor tiles. Applause from downstairs neighbor." Historians still argue whether these records were kept for medical research, civic pride, or just for fun. But the detail is impressive right down to the seasons when a snorer's tone would change. You see notes like winter equals nasal block plus extra depth, and spring pollen equals trills. You trail your fingers along a particular plaque for Claudia Minerva, whose snoring style is described simply as like a mother owl whispering bedtime stories through a clay flute. What a way to be remembered. At the far end of the hall stands a podium bearing the Codex Somniculum, the guild's only surviving handbook, bound in soft goat hide. It contains 84 chapters on nap ethics, dream etiquette, and the surprisingly detailed rules of the annual snoring decathlon. Events included Synchronized group drift. Slowest audible breath. Most creative pre-sleep posture. Loudest snore without waking self. Apparently, one year's winner perfected the side curl with one sandal off, a pose now banned for being unreasonably effective. You pause and imagine an ancient crowd gathered around a sleeping man, whispering in awe as his breath slows, deepens, and hits that perfect threshold of rumble and peace. And then you spot it. A shelf tucked near the floor. Not official guild members, but honorary snoozers, citizens who may not have trained, but whose natural sleeping style was so pure, so calming, so absolutely unbothered. They earned a plaque nonetheless. One entry is just a sketch of a farmer asleep on a donkey, mid-hiccup. Another is a child who, according to records, could fall asleep standing up, holding a half-eaten fig during a thunderstorm. You smile. Not everything here was performance. Some of it was simply joy in the ordinary. The kind of joy that can only come from watching someone you love drift off mid-sentence. Snuggled into a blanket made of nothing but time, you sit on the stone bench and close your eyes for just a minute, not to nap, but to remember what it means to honor rest. Not as escape, but as ceremony. The final hallway is narrower than the rest, so low you have to hunch just slightly, like the building wants you to bow before you leave. The air is drier here, tinged with the faint scent of warm parchment and something herbal, almost minty. As you shuffle forward, you pass through a curtain of woven flax, then pause, because you've entered the retirement nook. Yes, that's really what they called it. No fancy Latin inscription, just a small carved tablet reading, "For those who've dreamed enough." It's smaller than any chamber you visited, more intimate. 4 cots, a shelf of faded blankets, and in the center, a small fountain trickling over flat stones, humming like a lullaby sung by water itself. This is where long-serving guild members came to nap, not just between performances, but forever. One as a snorer had completed their final ceremony, contributed their final breath to a public sleep, and taught their final apprentice they'd spend their days here in quiet stillness, not in isolation. In celebration, you walk past one of the cots. A deep imprint still curves into the mattress, years old, but somehow still tender. A plaque nearby reads, "Cassianus Vero could soothe an angry goat with one sigh." You feel a twinge of envy, not for the fame or the talent, but for the peace. To have lived a life where your greatest contribution was silence, where your legacy wasn't battle or noise or empire, but rhythm, safety, softness. Historians still argue whether the retirement nook was spiritual or simply practical, whether it symbolized a passage to the afterlife or just a really comfortable ending. But the absence of grandeur feels deliberate. This wasn't about dying. It was about letting go. You kneel beside the fountain and trace one finger through the water. The stones are warm. Someone lights incense here still. Maybe the guild has long dissolved. Maybe not, but someone cares. Someone still whispers in this space. And you lie down, just for a second, and you listen. Not for words, not for visions, but for that perfect silence, the one shaped by 1,000 breaths, layered gently over centuries, curled like cats beside the past. And just as your own breath begins to slow, the story eases into its final dream. And now, as the last ember of candlelight flickers through the vaulted ceiling, you allow your body to become as still as the tapestries. No more turning pages, no more dusty scrolls, no more arguments about which snoring technique best resembled a low tide at sunset. Just you, here, wrapped in quiet, the rhythm of ancient breath trailing through your thoughts like silk over sand. Picture yourself in the retirement nook, stone walls softened by moss. The sound of trickling water echoing gently through your ribs. Maybe you're lying on that 4th cot. Maybe you're simply a breeze drifting through the flax curtain. Either way, you've arrived. No one needs anything from you here. Not your voice, not your cleverness, not your schedule, just your sleep. And maybe that's the best guild of all, the one where there are no dues, no exams, no applause, only soft pillows, warm air, and the knowledge that somewhere, long ago, someone once earned a badge simply for snoring beautifully enough to calm a restless city. Let that thought stay with you. Let it curl around your spine. Let your next breath be slower than the last. And if a small smile finds your lips in the dark, let it, because tonight you sleep among legends.